Howdy, everybody. So, have you ever heard the term a trucking mafia, or you know too much? Um, one of the things about being in trucking is you get to see how companies really operate. You know, you know what the costs are involved in shipping products. And you know where these corporations are, multiple locations, and a lot of times you end up learning a lot, and as a consequence, you know too much. So corporations like to hire useful idiots. I say that uh, in in response to that a lot of times people are not hired or they're not promoted because they're overqualified for the position that they're applying for. And it's like if you see this often, you go for an interview and your prospective employer or your boss is doesn't have as much experience as you do, or doesn't have as much education as you do, or certifications, or they're just not that smart. I even had trucking executives uh, tell me I'm an independent contractor. I'm a small business owner, and I run my own small business. I've had trucking companies tell me that they just want drivers. They don't care if you're smart or not. They just want drivers. And what does that tell you is that you're only useful to a corporation if you don't if you're not too informed, or not. I wouldn't say not smart enough, but if you're too smart, they don't like that. You're no longer useful to them because your eyes are open. A lot of times when you work for a corporation, they pull the wool over your eyes. They fill you full of uh, you know smoke. Just a lot of marketing. A lot of talk. Not a lot of action to back it up. So this is the idea of useful idiots. Have you ever heard like the boss? Boss is typically they're in charge of the useful idiots, but the idiots are like the flunkies. They weren't good enough to become the boss, or they're not good enough to be self-employed. And corporations can find use for them. So this is kind of a generic way of looking at it, but if you're too smart and you're not an idiot, a lot of people won't hire you because they don't find any use in hiring someone that is overqualified for the position. This is really going to be your motivation to be a small business owner. Because you're not going to get the opportunities because you're capable of much more. You're capable of being self-employed. You're capable of running a small business. If you go for a job interview and you understand profit and loss, you understand supply and demand, you understand how uh, you know pricing works, and customer service, and quality, and all these things, right? You understand a lot. Well, you're no longer useful. You should really take what you know and start your own small business. That's probably going to be your best bet, because there's a limit. I think that even you no longer want to be an employee, because you'll realize it yourself. You're like, look, there's nothing here that for me to learn. There's nothing here of value to me to work for someone else. Why do I want to report to someone who's less qualified than I am? Why do I want to report to somebody who's 10 or 20 years younger than I am? you know uh, That's really hard for an older worker to report to someone much younger with less experience. And I would say take that experience you have, which is great experience, and take your knowledge, take your skills, your ability, and apply it to something that's going to benefit you. Start your own business. You got it. You may not realize it, but over the years, you racked up a lot of great experiences. And this is why older workers, like say over 40, find it much more challenging to compete in the job market against younger workers. Younger workers are kind of like useful idiots. They don't know what they don't know. They don't have the experience. But an older worker, you know, they've been around the block a few times. When the boss is talking BS, they're highly skeptical, and the boss don't like that. The boss wants to be able to convince a younger worker to work harder, faster, you know, in order to make more profit. The older worker is less likely. The older worker is more likely to question the boss's instructions, or be highly skeptical of the boss and their motives. And as a result, older workers are sometimes not hired in favor of a more useful person who doesn't have the experience, is not going to question the boss, is going to do what they're told, is going to I would say a younger person probably might be faster, just because of their age. So you see this a lot in production environments where, the 40-year-old can't compete labor-wise, especially if it's like piece count work, with someone who's 18. 18, they're real fast. These kids are fast. They're young, they're energetic. The 40-year-old, it's got achy back and, bad knees from years of labor, and as a result, younger workers are preferred. You see this too with illegal immigration. A lot of times the immigrants are taken advantage of because they may not know the language, and they're desperate for money, and in many ways they become the useful idiots that get hired. They're preferred over maybe someone who's a more salty, experienced worker. It's something where corporations and employers, bosses and supervisors, they don't want to hire someone who's too smart, because that would compete for their own position. They want people who are compliant, that are not going to push back on their demands. So this is a challenge. If you're not an idiot, and you got good experience, and you're struggling to find meaningful employment, you probably would be better off to start your own small business. It's going to be much more valuable to you than working in a corporation for someone that really may not, in your eyes, deserve the position that they hold. A lot of times people get opportunities in a company that has nothing to do with merit. It may do more with politics or office politics. It's like, you get to a point in your age where it's like, I'm just tired of the games. I'm just tired of the office politics. I want the freedom and the opportunity to do it my way, to do it on my own. To have confidence in yourself that you can support yourself financially. It's a little scary at first to think, oh, I'm going to be self-employed. But then once you've done it for a couple of years, you're like, I'm never going back. This is the greatest thing. It's like, once you work for yourself, you don't ever want to work for anybody else. There's another saying in business too, is that you can't make money working for someone else. someone else is always going to make money off your labor. So let's just say, for example, a product costs $10, and you are hired to make that product. Um, wholesale, that product is probably $5 to manufacture, but they're going to sell it for $10. So out of that $5 it costs to manufacture for that one part, you might only be making $1 to make that part. But if you were a small business owner and you made your part yourself and it cost $5 to make and you sold it for 10, now you're going to make $5 profit versus $1 that you would have made if you were working for someone else. So you're always going to make more money working on your own as self-employed. Now, I wouldn't say in all cases, but in many cases, you're better off being self-employed than working for someone else. So I think at a certain age, certain years of experience, you're so wise in your work history for years and years and years of working for other people. It's time to work for yourself for once. So this is also true in trucking. Truck drivers are extremely, independent minded. They speak their mind. They will call BS in a heartbeat. And companies don't like that. They don't like the pushback. They don't want people to speak their mind freely. They want you to be obedient. They want you to comply. They don't want you to question. They want you to just do as you're told. If they could replace you with a robot, they would, without even thinking about it. So this is the idea that oftentimes the people that get hired or the people that get promoted aren't necessarily the best person, for that was in the interview. You could be the most highly qualified person for that job and not get the job. And you're like, why is that? Well, because you're too good. You're so good, you should have your own business, because the companies won't hire you. You're not a useful idiot. You're not an idiot. So it's like, look, we want useful idiots. Just like the trucking executive told me, they're like, look, we just want drivers. We don't want independent-minded business, people. They don't need that. What they need is butts in seats. They need drivers. That they don't want you there to think. They don't want you there to be analytical or try to understand things. They just want you to do as you're told. And they could care less about all the other stuff. So, well, for most people who have experience, this is very unsatisfactory. It's like, this is almost intolerable. It's like you have so much ability and it's being wasted working at these corporations who, could care less what you're capable of doing. They just want you to do what you're told and nothing more and nothing less. So this is why I think many truck drivers are interested in having their own small business. They want that freedom. They're ready. They know they're ready. Well, in most cases, guys who buy a truck and start their own business have had enough of the corporation and the stupidity that goes along with it, and they're ready to do it themselves. They're ready to run their own small business. They're ready to be self-employed. And that's that kind of mindset is what you're going to need in order to be successful, because now you're going to be working for yourself. Whether you are profitable or not profitable or successful or not, all depends on you. You had the instincts to recognize the need to become self-employed. Now it's on you to make it work. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.